Good morning. Welcome this morning. A lot of good visiting going on this morning. That's good. Welcome and welcome to our visitors. And this quarter we have been talking about David and Solomon. And I appreciate everybody's input, and hopefully today we'll have some more good input. If you'll be turning in your Bibles, please. We're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3. That will be our text today. It's going to be where we start. If we get all the way through it, we're going to go to another section in Ecclesiastes, but I'm not sure we're going to get there. But I'll try to keep the pace up and get all the way through as much as I can. So I appreciate, again, everybody's input and your presence here this morning. I'm going to start out the class with a question, so please feel free to give feedback and participate. I'd appreciate that very much. When you reflect on Old Testament characters, for what they're known for their characteristics, what are some of those that you come to mind immediately for some Old Testament characters, and what those characteristics might be?
Samson, and I think of strength.
Okay, Samson and his strength. He was on my list. Who else? David was a man after God's own heart. Very good. Solomon with his wisdom. And that's where we're going to be headed this morning. Who else? What about Abraham? What is he known for? Father of the faithful. He's known for his faith. Who else? Anybody else? Moses. His endurance, his faithfulness. Noah. Very good. Yes. Anybody else? Okay, well, we're headed to Solomon this morning. Thank you for your input. Obviously, Solomon's remembered for his wisdom. And after he became king of Israel, he listened to the advice of David, his father. And we read about a little bit of that last week and how he dealt with those that threatened the stability of the transition. But more importantly, he sought God's guidance in leading the nation. And he could have asked God for health, for wealth, for power. That's not what he asked for. Instead, Solomon requested that he be able to discern good from evil. And we're going to be reading that in chapter 3 here in just a moment. So Solomon's petition pleased God, and it reflected his desire to heed David's advice. And David said in 2 Samuel chapter 23, David said, "He who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God." So as Solomon began his reign, this was his goal. And in our text, we're going to be reading some of his great building projects that he started. We also see his wisdom on display. And he was given a wise and understanding heart. And despite his failures, he knew the importance on relying on God. And understanding this, Solomon said in Psalm 72, "Give the king your judgments, O God, and your righteousness to the king's son. He will judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice." So because Solomon asked God for help, he was blessed beyond all measure. He respected God. He was respected by his people. In verse 28, we're going to read here a little later in the lesson that all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. So let's read starting chapter 3 of 1 Kings, the first 3 verses there. And as we look at these three verses, we're going to see Solomon as a builder. So we're going to look at what Solomon had built. Starting verse 1, Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. So we're seeing here in the first few verses these building projects that Solomon had started. He began dispensing justice, his reign dispensing justice to those who needed to be reprimanded, those that David had told him to watch out for. And he obeyed David's command and recommendation. He ordered Joab's death. He, after Shimei violated the terms that they set, he too was put to death. And Solomon removed Abiathar from his position as priest and put Zadok in his place. So two of these men, Joab and Abiathar, supported Adonijah in his quest to become king. We read about that story, how Adonijah tried to insert himself in this transition. But Shimei cursed David, the moment of great vulnerability. I believe we read through that story. And having addressed these potential threats, then Solomon started out to head off problems with nations around him. So from these outside forces. So he began the process by making a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And to cement this newly formed relationship between the nations, Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter. And he brought her into the city of David in verse 1 until he had finished building his own house, the house of the Lord, and the wall around Jerusalem. So whether Solomon's willingness to marry the Egyptian princess was wise or not, or we're going to see later, it really was not the wisest thing to do. The union indicated now that Israel was a nation to be reckoned with. They were now on the international stage and having that international prominence of those around them. So we have a suggestion from a Bible scholar here in his study, and he says, while pharaohs took foreign princesses, they did not give away their daughters. The marriage represents a profound reversal of fortunes for Israel and Solomon. The former slave people had become an ally of their old enemy, the traditional superpower of the region. So with this marriage, then Israel and Egypt became allies at the time. And it was unusual because it was the Pharaoh's daughter and not one of the other princesses. But Solomon did not make a treaty, just make the treaties with foreign powers. He also oversaw these building projects. So all three of these building projects are important. Solomon's palace, his house, reminds us of the wealth that Solomon had possessed. The Solomon's temple is arguably his greatest accomplishment and denotes his devotion to God, at least at this time. And the wall that Solomon built around Jerusalem reflects Solomon's intent to keep the capital city safe from its enemies. So before Solomon built the temple, however, in verse 2, it says the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. So, I don't know if you remember, for a people that had been commanded by God in Deuteronomy chapter 12, Israel was told to destroy all the high places where the nations served their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. So this really was not an acceptable place for them to be worshiping. You remember God had commanded them to wipe out the gods as they came into the promised land, tear down all of the places that they were worshiping their pagan gods. And yet Israel should have worshipped in the place that God had chosen for them to worship, and that was in the temple. But because Solomon loved the Lord, he was determined to do what David couldn't do, and that was to build the temple. And until that was completed, Solomon also participated. He sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. So that took place in the meantime while the temple was being built, although that was not a great choice for Israel to be doing this, because all those places that had some kind of pagan meaning should have been torn down previously. Anybody have comments on those particular verses? Okay, let's look at then the verses 4 through 15. The first three verses we read, Solomon was a builder. These verses, then we're going to talk about Solomon being a prayer. He was speaking to God. He spoke with God in prayer. So starting verse 4, and the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God asked, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people?" It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, "Because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life, or riches, or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall rise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days." And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem, and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. So as we look in this particular section, we talked about the high places, and really it sets the stage for Solomon building the temple, and this remarkable dream that Solomon had, and as he was speaking with the Lord in his dream at Gibeon. Solomon had gone there to offer these 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar, signifying he obviously was dedicated to God. And this act certainly pleased the Lord, because he appeared to him in this dream in verse 5. God said in this dream, "Ask what shall I give you?" And Solomon was thus given the opportunity opportunity of a lifetime to ask God for whatever it was that was important to him. And because of his thoughtful response to God and to receive this wisdom, he not only received that, but much, much more. So Solomon responded to the Lord by praising him, by showing mercy, thanking him for showing mercy and kindness to his father David. He acknowledged that God was the reason that Solomon was sitting on the throne. Nevertheless, Solomon admitted he was unprepared to lead the people. And of all these things that Solomon could have asked, he asked the Lord for wisdom sufficient to lead the country, to lead Israel. And the Lord was very pleased with this humble request. So God was going to grant Solomon's request, and this wisdom that Solomon received was wisdom from above. It's going to be like no other wisdom that had been given to anybody. So importantly, God announced his intention to do even more, not just the wisdom, but all of those things that he was going to bless Solomon with, and that there's not going to be anyone like him among all the kings of all his days. So as long as Solomon served the Lord, he was going to enjoy God's blessings. And he returned after this dream to Jerusalem and worshiped God, and he would soon begin the building of the temple where Israel would come to worship God. This generating thoughts from anybody, comments in this section? I know we're going through this kind of fast. Okay, let's look I'm sorry. Does anybody have the age? I don't know if.
I think he was a little bitty kid.
No, he wouldn't have been a little bitty child. I think more he was speaking to his. Yeah, I think he was more speaking to his experience there. Let's look at then verses 16 through the end of the chapter. So we're going to see here just a stunning example of the wisdom that God had given to Solomon at this point. So we're going to read this particular story. Verse 16, 1 King chapter 3. Then 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Oh, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house, only we two were in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. And she rose at midnight, took my son from beside me, while your servant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had borne. But the other woman said, No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. Thus they spoke before the king. Then the king said, The one says, This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. And the other says, No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, Bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, Oh, my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. But the other said, He shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide him. Then the king answered and said, Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. So the scripture could have simply stated that Solomon had received this wisdom from God and it surpassed all others, but it provides this stunning example of Solomon's wisdom. So the king functioned as the ultimate judge of the people, and he was approached by these two women, and they were described as harlots, and this detail likely was provided and casted some doubt on their morality, and this is to amplify Solomon's wise decision. The women lived in the same house, gave birth around the same time. One woman's newborn died in the night because she lay on him, and to compound this tragedy, the woman whose son died arose, swapped the children for the living child, And then they start the argument about whose child was whose. So, not surprising, the other harlot denied having swapped the children. King Solomon thus was faced with discerning, okay, which one is telling the truth in this account? So there are no eyewitnesses, and without any eyewitnesses, how could he discern, okay, who is going to be telling the truth? How could even the wisest of individuals determine and fairly judge truthfully in this situation? So he stopped the quarrel by saying, "Bring me a sword." And he announced how the sword was going to be used by dividing the living child in two and giving half to one and half the other. So at this moment then, the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned for compassion for her son, said, "Oh, my lord, give her the living child. By no means kill him." But the other said, "Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him." So Solomon understood that the woman was willing to give up the child to save the child. So that was the child's mother. And all of Israel, because of this account, because of the account of his wisdom, stood in awe of the king and his wisdom, which was from God, to bring justice and rule justly for the kingdom. So, as we look at this chapter, a couple of things come to mind. One is Solomon is described as one who loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. Well, this phrase reminds us that love demands obedience. In 1 John chapter 5, verse 3, in this similar point, Apostle John wrote, "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome." And this description of Solomon also shows us that those who love the Lord can be guilty of doing things that are not pleasing to God. And we see this throughout Solomon's life. So God did not want his people worshiping at the pagan altars. And this was true in Solomon's day, and it remains true today, that we must obey the Lord in all things. Another thing that comes to mind in this particular chapter, that Solomon's desire to properly lead God's people led him to ask for wisdom. Now, God was willing to grant his request and provide Solomon with more than he asked. So God remains willing to provide wisdom to his people when they ask. We see in the New Testament in James chapter 1, verse 5, James writes, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him." So we see that was true not only for Solomon, but for us today, in asking for that wisdom. And we need to be looking at the wisdom that we're asking for. Is this a godly wisdom, or is this a wisdom of the world? And so we need to make sure that we are asking for the right thing. We want that godly wisdom that God imparts to us through his word, and we want to make sure that spiritually we have that spiritual wisdom of how to please him. So when we look at then this story and this chapter, another question: how do we learn to place more trust in God and less trust in our own abilities? So how do we learn to do that?
Probably the best way is just through experience. We learn by doing things and knowing that I probably shouldn't have done that by myself. I probably should have asked for God's help. I think a lot of the Old Testament characters found out the hard way.
So a lot of it comes by experience and realizing in outcomes that weren't very favorable that, I should have asked God for help in that. And there are a lot of Old Testament characters mentioned that happened to. So they made poor decisions, but realized after the fact that, I should have asked God for help.
I think when we awaken in the morning, that it's really the first thing that we ask is for wisdom to get through the day. So we will encounter something somewhere in that day that is going to take some more wisdom than we have. And we need God's guidance through it. So I think if we really think about it, we're not capable of directing our own footsteps.
Right.
So if we're not capable, we need to understand that first thing in the morning, that we're gonna need help. And the things that you say and the things that you do, you need to have the wisdom of God, because as it says, we're just not capable. And when man thinks that he is smart enough to make it on his own, that he falls on his face. It just can't be done. But there's, you go to Romans chapter 7, there's that war going on in the mortal man. There's the good and there's the evil. And if we need God's help to defeat the evil, and that should be, pretty much mandatory. We get up your name every day, when we're gonna make mistakes.
Right. Those are great comments. I don't know that I can relay on the speaker all of them, but the man is not knowledgeable to direct his own path, and we don't have the knowledge to know make every decision. But if we consistently and regularly and make it a habit of every morning getting up and asking for God's blessings, for God's wisdom, and what comes up that day, help us to know what's right from wrong. Help us to be able to discern what the decision should be made. That is so important to us to recognize. We can't rely on our own wisdom or our own understanding. We need God's help.
That's the thing about it is, brother, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Definitely, we can become knowledgeable on a lot of things, but wisdom comes from God. And we gain wisdom by asking and doing what He says do. We do according to His will, then we have insight. But we confuse a lot of times knowledge and wisdom, and knowledge is not good.
Right.
So we say, he's a smart man, I'm a smart man. What is a smart man? You got wisdom, not the knowledge.
Right.
I know a lot of people, including myself, think they know a lot, but they make bad decisions.
So wisdom is not knowledge, is it? So we may have a lot of knowledge about certain area, certain things, but we still we don't have that wisdom to be able to apply those decisions to make good choices. We may know a lot about and have that knowledge, but that wisdom that comes from God and that we're asking for is really what we need to be able to make those decisions and to be able to apply that knowledge that we do have to make good choices and good decisions. Understanding is what he asked for. Right. So it's that understanding that he asked for, which is invaluable in life, to be able to understand what God's will is, understand maybe with the knowledge that we already have, how to use that knowledge. But I ask for that understanding of how to apply it and how to make those choices. Right. So that wisdom Brother Basson was talking about was in his family. His father was very wise. He's saying he knew where he was going. He knew how to get there. He asked God, he knew there was something beyond this life. And he knew, this life was temporary. So he was able to make some of those decisions, look ahead. He had that understanding that here we read about where God had given Solomon. Mm-hmm. I hope all of you were able to hear that, because that was very encouraging, sound wisdom about the comfort that we get from knowing that he got from his father and getting benefits of his father's wisdom, knowing that his father was going to tell him the truth, and he knew that his father, what he told him may not have been something that he wanted to hear, but it was going to be a wise counsel and wise and truthful, and it was very encouraging and helpful in that manner. Just like, as we look for wisdom, having that relationship with God, just like Brother Batson had that relationship with his father. If we have that relationship with God our Father, we need to make sure we're reading, we're looking at that counsel that he's giving us through his word, and it may not be, we may come to the realization it's not something we necessarily want to hear, but we find comfort that, that's something we need to do. That's something we need to obey. We need to honor what's being told to us in that wise counsel. So thank you for you're very eloquent in giving those comments. Thank you for that. This was only one story in this chapter to show Solomon's wisdom. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 11. And the book of Ecclesiastes it almost serves as a diary that Solomon is writing to share his wisdom. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 22, it says, "So King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom." So we might consider him having the golden touch, because everything he did gave the ability to succeed because of this wisdom that had been imparted to him. And he was well equipped to give advice, just like we've talked about, giving that sound, wise advice to other people. He was well equipped to share that with us. So as we're looking then in this particular chapter in Ecclesiastes, you might say this is a strategy for success that Solomon is sharing for us. Again, as he's writing this, it's almost like a diary. In his life, Solomon tried a lot of different things to try to find out what life was really about. And he came down to basically say you can't truly be happy without God. But during his life, he experimented with a lot of different things, made a lot of different errors, failures, things that we can learn from. And everything from those sensual sexual experiences to strong drink to he had that experience in creative building projects. He had knowledge of science of that day, and he had the knowledge of political knowledge and pursuing that political power. So he experimented with all these things, but he was careful to record his observations as he was doing this. And we here in a short form in Ecclesiastes chapter 11 are some of, we'll say, Solomon's 7 strategies for success. Now these are more, I would say, more focused on worldly pursuits, not so much spiritual, but it's still very, very meaningful, the things that we can gather from his experience. Verse 1 in Ecclesiastes 11, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days." Well, this concept might be you've got to give in order to get. So this is a business principle. There's no return without investment. You've got to invest, and there's not going to be any reward without some kind of risk. But, there are no opportunities for success in areas that you don't make that investment of time, of effort, of self-discipline, and the general giving of yourself. So people fail. When they fail, they usually make excuses. They try to place blame on other people. They have this resentment and anger. But those who succeed, on the other hand, they succeed because they're willing to give something of themselves in order to achieve their goals. So an old saying is true today as it was in Solomon's day: the more you give, the more you get. Verse 2 here in this chapter says, "Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth." So you might look at this as, titling this as to diversify. Successful people understand that sometimes bad stuff happens, and you've got to be prepared if you're going to be wise, and it's smart to have a backup plan and a second window of opportunity, perhaps. And success doesn't always come with that first or second or even third attempt or whatever it is that you're trying to do. Sometimes it comes later, much later, and it may come in an area that we would not have expected. It might have surprised us. So successful people develop as many of their talents and pursue as many opportunities as time and energy permit. I'll go a little quicker through this. We may be able to get through this. Verse 3, "If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth, and if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall lie." So one thing you might say is, don't worry about things you can't change. So Solomon uses examples in nature and a lot of these things to say, you can't control, don't worry about the things you can't control. You can't change them once they take place. So it's saying we don't succeed at every step. And things happen that we can't control, and when they do, we've just got to roll with the punches. We've just got to keep moving forward. So to succeed, again, we need to use what we have where it'll do the most good, and without regard for those things that are impossible for us to control. Verse 4, "He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap." This might be an admonition to say, do it now. There's never a perfect time to begin. Most instances, we simply need to begin or else lose the opportunity at hand. There's always going to be a reason to put off doing something, and always a pretty good excuse for not starting something. even if it's difficult, we may make excuses to put it off. But Solomon in this wisdom is saying successful people, they act on their dreams, on their goals, and on the vision right away. The best time to begin succeeding at your dream or goal is right now. And putting it off until tomorrow, you're not going to avoid, anything but not being successful. So do it now. Verse 5, as you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening do not withhold your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, either this or that, or whether both alike will be good. So we might be saying here in these verses, you never know until you try. So that kind of came up in our earlier conversation. Some things we don't see, but they are nevertheless real. Success can't be obtained or even seen until a person actually tries. So other people may be blind to the possibility. They may not have your vision of what you're trying to do or vision of the future. Many people won't support your efforts. They may be jealous of what you're trying to do, whether it's successful or not. But Solomon is telling us to believe the evidence of the unseen, believe the evidence of God and the power of faith. So you never know until you try, but if you don't try, you'll never know. Verses then 7 through 9. Truly the light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. But if a man lives many years and rejoices in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that is coming is vanity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these God will bring you into judgment. So whatever we do, we need to remember God's judgment. Success is great, and it was meant to be that way. We're supposed to feel good about that success. He didn't create us to be unhappy, but to be productive and joyful and successful. But this pleasure that we may get from feeling the success, it's not the end of life, nor is the goal of life. So our goal is to know and to obey God. And success is that byproduct of living to please and know and serve God. So we'll stop there. You want to read the end of that, rest of that chapter. The last verse just talking about success being sweet, but success is short. We may be successful, but it's temporary, and life on this earth is temporary. And our real goal should be being faithful to God and asking for His wisdom. So thank you for your